Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. By the way, there's something else you can do as well. You can share an episode with a friend. Remember, it helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base. I want to talk with you this morning about issues of very great import. And I want to begin by saying the toughest thing I have to do every day is come up with the issues and present them in a clear, precise, and limited fashion so we can discuss them together. So let me begin with Ukraine. What happened last night in Kiev and in Ukraine in general was an unmitigated disaster. The Russian assault on Ukraine continues, and that assault is creating havoc, causing damage, causing death. And where is the world in all of this? You know, in the old days, when you had an Edward R. Murrow saying, "This is London," or you had a Walter Cronkite reporting from Vietnam, when you had a trusted news person who was listened to by, well, all of us, there was a way to call attention to a situation and make it real. We don't have that in the case of Ukraine. The reporting is scattered, not particularly effective. And although we can recount the facts, it is not the drama of being able to, in person, report what's happening. Let me be crystal clear. We are confronting an international crisis, and there is little or no attention to it. And that has to do with what is happening in Ukraine. The Russian assault on Ukraine, which continues to wreak havoc and death and destruction, receives virtually no attention from the world, in part because of a feeling of impotence. If there were no nuclear weapons in the world, there would have been a war in Europe over Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. But as long as Vladimir Putin is able to rattle the nuclear saber, and as long as there is a real threat of nuclear war, the world has no choice but to stand by and do virtually nothing. Let's be clear. If this were a conventional time, I believe there would have been a war over Ukraine. But now, there's really nothing that we can do. Donald Trump has decided not to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine because he knows that it would escalate the situation considerably. I don't know that there is anything else we can do except provide conventional military aid. But you know what? It's not enough. If you take a look at what's happening in Kiev, if you take a look at what's happening in the Ukraine, the destruction mounts, and there is literally nothing that we can do to prevent these constant attacks. If there were a reporter on the scene with the credibility of an Edward R. Murrow or a Walter Cronkite, the world might understand the real effect of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. But that's clearly not the case. It's a different world, and the whole coverage is different. So I want to say to you right now that this effort that the Russians are making now to cow the Ukrainians and destroy their will to fight, well, it's something we need to be aware of and understand. And we need to reinforce our European allies, not with nuclear weapons, but with a sense that there is something that can be done by offering the Ukrainians all the weapons they need. But this is still not going to solve the problem. There's no way to force the Russians out. And Ukraine is in a position where even negotiation won't work. We know that Donald Trump has urged the Ukrainians to accept a negotiation which would permit the Russians to maintain a permanent presence in Ukraine. The Crimea, gone, essentially. And this is really unacceptable. What do I mean by unacceptable? I mean that the world needs to understand that this kind of naked aggression needs to be resisted. Tragically, and I say this with deep regret, there seems to be nothing, no force to stop Vladimir Putin. And so, my friends, the tragedy of Ukraine will continue to unfold, and the impotence of the United States and the West in the face of Russian aggression will remain real. And the dream that Vladimir Putin has of perhaps rebuilding the Soviet Empire, a greater imperial Russia, with Ukraine as the cornerstone of that rebuilding, continues. But there is a second issue here in the United States, and that has to do with the Epstein files. I want to be clear about Epstein. What he did was monstrous, and he is now dead. But his legacy lives on, and you can see the White House on the defensive, and you can see clearly, precisely, that the Republicans, well, they're not supporting Donald Trump on this one. There is no doubt that there will be at least 30, 40, 50, maybe more Republicans in the House of Representatives who will vote to bring this question to the floor of the House. The White House is resisting it. Now, the question is why? I spoke yesterday about a cover-up, and I believe the White House is trying to cover up for Donald Trump. When I say the White House, Donald Trump gives the orders. He's responsible. I want to agree with many of the Republicans who have said to Donald Trump, just let it all out. Release the information. You may be embarrassed, but if there's no criminal action, you'll be fine. I think it is an embarrassment to Donald Trump, an embarrassment to the Republicans in the Congress. And when a member of Congress can be brought to the Situation Room at the White House, and there's an attempt to bully her into not supporting this, it doesn't look good for the White House. It doesn't look good for Donald Trump. Look, President Trump may be embarrassed, but if he's not done anything criminal, it doesn't matter. Let him suffer the embarrassment. But let's also understand the real tragedy is that those who support Donald Trump seem unwilling to admit that something is rotten here. Something is wrong. And so my appeal today is to the Republicans. Get a backbone. Let the papers, let the information get out. Let the world see whether Donald Trump did something, well, that is embarrassing. And let me remind you, he would not be the only president of the United States to be embarrassed by conduct while in office and before he was in office. And there is another aspect of all of this which needs to be discussed. Yesterday, Donald Trump sat down with his key military advisors to talk about Venezuela and action that may be taken by the United States military. Now, we don't know what the outcome is, but we do understand something very clearly, something that needs to be reinforced. A president of the United States, when it comes to foreign policy, is king. And Donald Trump is acting the role. I can't tell you what he will do, but I can tell you that Congress is impotent. Why? Because he will not rely on the War Powers Act, which, by the way, broadens a president's power, doesn't limit it. I've told you the story in the past of my discussions with Tom Eagleton, the former senator who was the author of the original War Powers Act resolution, which he ultimately voted against because, as he told me in an interview, what we would have done passing this, and what was done passing this, is to expand the president's powers when it comes to making war. This is something we must understand, that what is happening now in Venezuela and the ability of the president to do things on the ground and perhaps by sea and air in Venezuela with no check on the power of a president makes it more imperative that we understand that when we elect a person president, we better know what we're getting, or at least try to. So we're watching what happens in Venezuela with great care. And of course, the other key element here is the government shutdown is over. Now, that doesn't mean everything is up and running, nor does it mean that everything will be restored. And I want to remind everyone that one of the things Donald Trump did during the shutdown was make more cutbacks. And even before the shutdown, he had cut back considerably on a variety of personnel, key, essential personnel. And what that means, very bluntly, very clearly, what that means is that simply reopening will not solve the broader problem. Oh, speaking of a broader problem, have you seen the weather information for Southern California? There are going to be massive storms, and there will be, without a doubt, tremendous action when mudslides begin to take place. And here's the question for you. Where is FEMA? Where is NOAA? Where are the handles in the American government when you deal with a crisis like the one we're going to confront in Southern California? Let me point out that the Trump administration has gutted FEMA, has gutted the question of NOAA and its role, and that there are real implications to what Donald Trump has been doing. To my friends in Southern California, particularly in the Palisades, we are hoping for the best and anticipating the worst. And that's what we must do, given what seems to be taking place. The damage done will not be the fault of Donald Trump, but the response to the damage that may be done will be the fault and the responsibility of an administration which seems to be abdicating its role. This is a crisis situation, and it doesn't just affect Southern California. It affects all of us around this country, because when a disaster takes place, it is the theory of the Trump administration that the states should respond. Let me be clear. The states don't have the money or the manpower or the ability to respond as effectively as the federal government. And so the Trump administration's domestic policy in terms of cutbacks is now going to be revealed. You understand this all comes together in a very tragic but neat package. What do you have when you have a president of the United States who has gutted the effectiveness of government? And let me also point out, as we get everything up and running, well, we've got a problem. Because a lot of the people that were needed to make sure that the up and running government would work are no longer there. And there is only one person at fault, and that is Donald Trump and his administration. These are trying times on so many levels. I've touched on just a few issues with you this morning. But this weekend, you and I will be following the news. We'll be following carefully what happens. And that information, ladies and gentlemen, will lead us to other conclusions dealing with the effectiveness of this administration and the actions of Congress and, well, so much more. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts. You can drop a comment on YouTube or Spotify. You can click any of the links in the show notes to connect with me on social media. Remember to share this episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which is, of course, our goal. And now, the weekend. Have a great weekend, but realize that the world continues to turn and that we have a lot to examine and look at. You know that this show has been getting so much positive attention that we're excited to bring on advertising support. This will help us create more opportunities for Around the Political World, and we're happy to share some of the enticing advertising that we hope you will enjoy. So this means you'll be hearing more from us and from our advertisers in the days ahead. We appreciate your support, and of course, have a great weekend. I am John Rothman. I'll be back on Monday with more of Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you then.